Welcome to Wayward Writers. I'm Senior Literary Agent and author Heather Cashman.
I'm author and writing coach Stephanie Bearce.
And I'm author and writing coach Nikki Jacobsmeyer.
Our mission is to nurture and enrich established writers throughout their publishing journeys.
We welcome all genres, age groups, and publishing paths through video podcasts, online webinars, in-person retreats, and more.
We're here to help you conquer your path.
Today, we'd like to welcome author Sarah Angleton with us. She's going to talk to us about historical fiction. So welcome.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Nikki, will you tell us a little bit more about
I would
Sarah?
love to. Sarah and I are part of a local writing group, and we've known each other for years and have critiqued each other's work. And yeah, it's absolutely my honor. Sarah Angleton is the author of 4 historical novels, a humor collection, and more than her fair share of blog posts. She lives near St. Louis with her husband, 2 almost grown sons, and 1 dog who rudely wakes her up at 4 o'clock every morning. If she ever gains access to a time machine, the first place she will be going is the 1904 World's Fair. For now, you can catch up with her at www.sarah-angleton.com. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you.
We are so excited to hear you. And I love about the World's Fair comment, which we will definitely get into later for sure. But can you just share your journey and what got you into writing?
In the 3rd grade, I had a teacher who very forcefully told her students that we were going to participate in the annual Young Authors Contest in Illinois. And so I reluctantly did that. And I was thrilled to win a regional nod, and I got to go to my first ever writers conference that was specifically designed, of course, for children and with children's authors, and it was a wonderful event, and I just caught the bug. If you fast forward a few years, then I had to decide what my major was going to be in college and what I was going to do with my life, and I told my oldest brother that I wanted to be an author, and he said, "Oh, don't you want to make money?"
I'm sorry, I probably
We've all heard this.
Yeah. So I majored in zoology. And I got that degree that I never particularly used. And then eventually I had an opportunity to go back to school. And so I went back for literature and creative writing and just got the ball rolling. And it's been rolling ever since.
Great. So. That's awesome. Did you say zoology?
Yes.
Okay, so have you used any of that knowledge in any of your work or plan to?
So I hadn't particularly, although there was an orangutan in one of the books, and so I did get to use some of the knowledge to understand their behavior a little bit and put some realism into the book, but not until this most recent one that's just coming out did I really get to do it because it's set in a zoo setting and has a lot of the interactions and a lot of the animal behaviors are things that I experienced when I was working in a zoo.
So cool.
That sounds interesting. We understand that you have experienced both traditional and self-publishing. And can you tell us a little bit about that and how and why you feel like the self-publishing path has been the best for you?
Yeah, I can. It's a little bit of a sad story, actually.
Come talk, but we'll be braced for it, okay?
Yeah. Yeah. The first novel that I ever wrote did end up, and I was really excited about it. It was going to come out. I put out my humor collection as a preparation for advertising that new book. And that one I self-published intentionally. And the press that was supposed to have the book come out, we had a publication date set and everything was looking good. I'd seen galleys, and then they just stopped communicating and went out of business.
Oh, that is sad.
And yeah, and so took my rights with them for a little while. Fortunately, I had a contract that had an end date, so I did get those rights back. But in the meantime, I had a lot of people who were really excited about this book coming out. I'd worked on trying to get the word out there, and I had been working on a companion novel to it. And so what I decided to do was to go ahead and self-publish that one first, and then ended up publishing the first one second when I got the rights back. And so then the next 2 novels, it really ended up just being a matter of timing. My 3rd historical novel was White Man's Graveyard, and it is a family story, and I was told to write it by my aunt. And And unfortunately, she passed away before I had an opportunity to get it out into the world. And when that happened, it happened during COVID, and we were not able to get together as a big family to do a memorial service, but we decided that we were going to be able to by the next fall. And I just thought, I just have to have this book ready to give to my family. And so that became then a self-publishing project. And then this one, in order to coincide with the 120th anniversary of the World's Fair in St. Louis, which is where the new one is set, that ended up being an issue of timing too. So it's not necessarily that I am opposed to traditional publishing, and I might even end up there someday. It's just that so far it hasn't really worked out, and that's okay. I've really enjoyed having total creative freedom over my work and what happens to it. And I realize that if I do end up on a traditional path, I'm going to have some distribution advantages for certain and probably a lot of other advantages, but I'm going to give some things up too.
There's a give and take on either one, but it sounds like you're enjoying and being successful with the self-publishing.
I'm enjoying it.
That's great.
Another avenue of self-publishing is our blogs and our websites. So can you tell us a little bit more about your blog and how often you post? And do you think that having a blog affects your readership and your fan base?
Yes, I do. When I originally started it's been about 12 years now since I started my blog. And when I originally did that, I had written my first novel, just a draft of it. And I was part of a Writers Guild in Oregon at the time. My family was living in Oregon, and we were part of Willamette Writers. And I had a critique group and everything. I was learning a ton about the industry that they do not teach you in MFA programs. And somebody said, "Oh, well, if you don't blog, are you even trying to sell a book?" And so I thought, oh, I would like to sell my book, so I'm going to blog. And it turned out it's just a really good format for me. I really developed a voice and developed a following, and I enjoy it. I post once a week. I always have, with the exception of having young kids and now not so young kids. Family stuff gets in the way sometimes, but mostly once a week. And in those 12 years, I have really developed relationships with a lot of people, both in the blogosphere, and I have a lot of readers that will tell me all the time, even though they don't always comment, they're keeping up with me. They're keeping touch.
Nice.
And I do hear from them. I get emails from people who are reading the blog and are excited about the blog. And directly, do I get more sales from it? I'm not sure, but it has helped me just put together a little community that helps to shout about my books.
Yeah.
And that's very helpful.
How does the content on your blog intersect with the content in your novels?
So I decided really early on, because I was writing historical fiction, that I needed to write about history on my blog. Because one piece of advice that was very good that I got early on too was that if you write about writing, then you're only going to attract other writers, not necessarily people who are going to buy your book. And so I wanted to attract people who really appreciate history and stories in history. But I also am not a historian. I'm an amateur at research, and I do a thorough job, I think. Maybe not always on the blog, but in my novels I certainly do. And in order to not claim authority, I decided to make it light and humorous and partly just my own perspective on history. And I think my voice really comes through.
It absolutely
and
does.
I think, yeah.
No, it does.
And yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And readers have come to trust, I think, that I'm going to tell them a story that's worth reading. And even though there's not as much of me, at least on the surface level in the books, I do think that there's some similarity in the way that I approach story, and I think readers do see that and respond to that.
Yeah, and I think just personally, because I do read your blog, I've always been amazed by your consistency, not only on consistently posting, but the quality of your post and this little like time capsule you get when you get to be in there. And I think there's a lot of people out there that started blogs and they stop, and you've been doing it for over a decade. And so hats off to you. I think that's phenomenal. So
If I stopped, my mother would be mad.
You've got
So
a lot
I
of
keep
people
going.
in your
Sarah,
good
you got some
accountability partner there.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
For sure.
That's great.
Well, and I know your first short stories that you put out, Launching Sheep, obviously has a different feel than the other novels. So I wanted to see if you could give us a blurb about that one and just a blurb about your historical novels.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So Launching Sheep is a blog to book project. It almost exclusively comes from content from the first 5 years of my blog. And it came out as an anniversary kind of celebration, which tells you a little bit about the timeline of the book too, because then I didn't publish that. I started the blog right after I finished writing that first book, and I didn't publish that until 6 months before it was supposed to come out. So it was a while. But anyway, but yes, that one is, I call it history and personal essay and humor and ridiculous. I mean,
Yes, it's like a great
that's
coffee book, or
Tell us a little bit
when
about the ridiculous.
yes. The ridiculous is that I wrote a story about the history of bagpipes because my son, when he was in second grade, was absolutely determined to learn the bagpipes, and I was determined to discourage it. And there was a thing about how at one point the bagpipe was classified as a weapon of war. And so I talked about our family battle against
Oh, that's great.
that possibility. I did win that one. He never played the bagpipe.
Yay! Good for you. And then, okay, so then after Launching Sheep, you had your
Yeah.
Smoke Rose, correct?
Yes, Smoke Rose to Heaven was the first one I wrote. So it was the second one published. And that one is a coming of age novel set in the 1830s and 40s. And it is the story of a little girl who's been abandoned by her father to a horrible, overzealous aunt. And in the course of her trying to find family and guidance, she stumbles on a historical smoking gun in a conspiracy theory that sort of has some major implications for the early history of the Mormon Church, actually. That one just came out of some personal research. And then Gentleman in Misfortune, which I actually wrote after that one, is a companion novel to it. And it is the story of a gentleman swindler who steals a shipment of mummies and tours them across the United States and displays them. Along the way, loses some and falls in love with someone he shouldn't fall in love with, and all kinds of trouble. But it does actually share some characters and even a couple of scenes from a slightly different perspective, and so the timelines intersect between those two novels, so they can be read in either order.
How fun. That sounds great.
Very cool. What in your novels, I think the covers are gorgeous. And business question
you.
is, did you use the same artist and designer for all of your novels?
I do, and I have been so lucky.
You can
in
tell.
him. His name is yeah,
Like
amazing.
there's a fluidity to your covers, which is awesome.
There
A
is,
brand.
yes. He's very intentional about that. He's very talented, and yeah, and I really lucked into him because he is not primarily a cover artist, although he does do book covers, obviously, as part of his business, but really he does like major ad campaigns, and he has much bigger clients than me. So sometimes I have to wait, but he's always worth the wait, and he always gives me something beautiful, and I've loved everyone more than the last.
Good.
Everyone has been my favorite.
Good. I feel like waiting is a synonym of publishing, is it not? Some days, right?
Can be, yeah. For sure.
So you're doing history. And if you're doing history, and I'm sure you are, you've got to be doing a lot of research. Can you tell us a little bit about your research process for your historical fiction?
Sure. Yeah, it varies a little bit on what subject I'm approaching. I start with a very broad approach. I maybe have in mind a few historical people that I want to include. I maybe have in mind a few historical events that I want to include. I have a rough era where I want to be to. And so I learn as much as I possibly can about those things first. And then I find my story in that somehow. And once I find the story, then I outline. And then I realize as I'm outlining that, okay, there are more specific research questions that I have to go in and answer. And so then I go after those. And once I do that, then I can set that aside and then I can draft. And I draft straight through from beginning to end and just put notes where I need more historical information, more research. And because otherwise I will spend 2 hours looking up what kind of fork did they use in whatever time period. Which is not productive. It is a fun detail, but it's not very productive. So it's better to find that detail later. And anyway, so then I do that. And then I've realized at that point that, oh, okay, there's a lot more of these questions that I have to answer, and it builds and then it's a back and forth at that point between the narrative, the story, and the research.
Do you ever find that the research that you go back and get afterwards derails your plot or your character where it is?
Yes. Yes, that does sometimes happen. I call myself a really firm plantster. I
I love that.
or plotster, I'm not sure. I've heard that before. It's not original with me, but yeah, I outline, but I loose outline because that very thing does happen. And two, the characters speak and they do things that you didn't expect them to do. And we've probably all experienced that when writing. And so the story will go in a slightly different direction than you thought. Or yes, you discover that historical detail that you were hinging everything on is anachronistic by 10 years and you can't use it. And so, yes, I do have those moments, but you go back and you fix it. And
in the beginning, do you just decide, oh, I'm interested in 1820, so I'm going to go and research 1820? Or do you more say, okay, I want to write a novel thematically about something, and so I'm going to go to an event?
that has varied by novel for me. The first two came out of, the first one with the historical conspiracy theory came out of just coming across that conspiracy theory and realizing that there's this hole, there's a smoking gun that's missing from history. And so I just thought we should have a character who can find it. So then I did all kinds of research about that particular theory, and that branched off in a whole bunch of directions. And my next one was inspired primarily because research for that first novel yielded a story that had a shadowy sort of person in it that history isn't quite sure who it was. And I just happened to have this character who was a bit role in the first novel who I thought, oh, he could impersonate that guy. He could be that person. So then I had to research how to make that happen. My third novel was inspired by a family diary from the 1830s that we found after my grandmother died beneath the false bottom of a drawer of a lawyer cabinet that she'd had in her possession for obviously a long time. I don't think she knew she had the diary.
Bravo.
That's neat.
Can we
how
just,
exciting.
yes,
Yeah.
Heather's got it right. Bravo.
It was very exciting. Yes, it's like the dream. That's
Yes.
the
That's
origin
so
story
cool.
every author would like to tell. But yeah, and so that led to a particular moment in history that this diary was written during and about. And so then I headed out to find specifically, okay, what was going on around this event, and also these people, although they were hard to research because they were not famous.
Sarah, I'm sure every novel's different with that, but also time-wise, how generally long does it take you before you even start outlining? But like that general beginning research where you're marinating in what you might want to tell.
I'm getting faster.
Good for you.
But yeah, years. It can take
Oh, wow.
years. I mean, that first one I was probably ruminating on that for a couple of years before I really sat down to write. I'm researching one right now that I think from conception of idea to actually putting down a draft is probably going to be closer to 8 months.
Oh, wow.
So I'm
That's a
getting
lot
there.
faster.
That's amazing.
Gosh, I know researching somebody who is not famous is so much more difficult. What are your go-to sources for your research?
So I always try to look for first person narratives as much as I can. And if it's not necessarily for that historical person, if they are real, most of my characters are fictional, but I did in White Man's Graveyard, my third one on the family history, it was very real people. But even if I can't find the first person narratives of that person, if I can find first person narratives of somebody who maybe touched on that person a little bit, their lives intersected or something, a lot of times that will really help. That's where the gold is. I was very fortunate. I have two main protagonists in that novel. That's two main real historical protagonists, and it goes back and forth between the two. They're a brother and a sister. And 19th century being what it is, the sister, there's not much information on her. She didn't get married until later in life. And so I have a few references that her brothers made about her. I have a few letters. I have a little bit in her journal, which was not as full as I would have liked it to be. But so I did have to invent some of her story. With him, it was a little bit easier because I did finally manage to track down. He did have a journal. It took me a while to get there, but I found it. But he also was the editor of a newspaper for a while, and so I got to read some of his editorials, so I got some of his perspectives on things. And then I also found, because he was a missionary physician to Liberia, and I found other missionaries who were there around the same time who did write even more precise journals, and so sometimes they mentioned him, sometimes they didn't, but I knew they were at least talking about some of the same types of things. And so those are really my best sources when I can find them.
How did you go about to even finding the personal journals, though? 'Cause that's got to be hard sometimes, locating where they're being stored, who has them.
Yeah, and that one, actually, that's amazing. I love librarians. I love librarians.
I do too.
Amen.
They are the best people in the world.
Yeah.
And this was a case of, I knew that this journal that he had written existed because it was referenced in somebody else's scholarly work in a dissertation. And so I tried looking it up based on the reference information that she had. I did know what library had it, and I contacted them. It was at Drew University in New Jersey, and they couldn't find it based on the information that she had in her works cited. So I tried to contact her, and she has since moved to South Korea, and I could not. There was a language issue with trying to even email her and get in touch with her. So then I was looking through her acknowledgments and trying to find people who knew her so that maybe I could find a way through them to reach out to her to see if she had this or had any more information. In the meantime, I was looking up a different question entirely, and I came across a blog post that was written by an archivist at Drew University. It was several years old, but in it he was talking about something else that they had in the archives, but he mentioned this, that we also have this diary this journal that's written by SME Goheen, which was my great uncle. So I contacted Drew because I couldn't find his name on their list of librarians. So I contacted Drew and said, who is this guy? Because this is the blog post and this is what I have. And they said, he's at Yale now. Here's his contact information. I contacted him. Within an hour, he got back to me and said, oh, this is wonderful. I'm really excited that you're doing this. Give me like a day and I will find you the reference.
Oh.
And he did.
That's
and
right.
He said, this is exactly what you need to tell them and they will be able to find it. And so then I could, and then I got it. So it was a labor of love.
I mean, for us researching nerds, like that is bring you to tears.
It's like a treasure hunt, though.
Yes.
It is. And that's the fun stuff,
Yeah.
right? And that was a case where, too, I had written a draft of that novel, but once I had his actual diary, it changed a lot of things because I found a lot of really great stuff that I wanted to include, and there goes another draft.
But what an exciting way to change it, though.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
the novel. That's amazing. Great story.
Yeah.
So when you're just starting out, obviously you're hitting Google, but are there any other tips that you can, for researching?
I have had great luck with looking for the scholars. Who are the scholars that are working on this era? Because they are going to very carefully reference where they've looked and
Good
what
tip.
they've read. So.
That's excellent. You touched on this earlier, but so let's say you're doing all this research and you can just get buried in research. At least I can. I just love researching and I love learning and I'm so curious. So how do you rein that in and decide, okay, I have enough information to start writing this, or kind of that balance between, you said sometimes you get more information than you have to rewrite. So
Yeah.
when do you think is a good time for someone to decide that they can stop researching and start writing?
Yeah. So for me, it's very much when I have a solid idea of the plot. And I don't necessarily go into my research knowing, because I want that plot to be informed by the events and the things that are happening around my characters. And so once I have a really firm idea of what that plot is going to look like, and I know what questions I absolutely have to have answered, then I can draft. Then I can go back and I can supplement with more research as I need to, because you can just get overwhelmed. And I have this tremendous sense at some point in every project that, oh, I am not the person who can write this because I just don't know enough. But at some point, too, you have to realize, no, it's your story and you have a perspective on it. And even if you don't know everything there is to know, it's okay. You have.
It is fiction, right?
Right.
So how do you also balance this idea of staying true to the historical characters, but also making it a fictional novel?
And that is really hard to do. That's a great question. And mostly the way that I have dealt with that is that I make my primaries fictional most of the time. White Man's Graveyard was the one exception because, of course, the main characters were my own family. And that was by far the most difficult book that I've written so far. And it's because of that, because life doesn't fit a really good story arc. It just doesn't. And so you have to find out, okay, where in those people's lives can you start it and stop it to end up with a good story arc? And yeah, you do have to make decisions when you go along. And two, you'll get different opinions on this, but I'm of the opinion that it's okay to compress some events if you need to. It's okay to move things around a little bit as long as you're clear with your reader that is what you're doing. Note, as long as they understand, or as long as you've explained to them anyway that you've made that an intentional choice. But yeah, it's hard. It's definitely a balancing act, and every reader is going to come at it differently. You only have to wander into a Facebook group on historical fiction for a day or two to get the heated debate. Oh, it has to be historically accurate, and everybody has their line that they have to find.
Absolutely. So you just said White Man's Graveyard was your hardest to write of the four.
Yes.
Can you give us a little example as to why for you?
It's partially because I was writing about real people who have a real life arc as opposed to a story arc. And so finding out where that story was going to start and stop was important. It also was difficult just because this is even 5 generations removed. This is my family. And when you write historical fiction too, you also have to balance between, we look at history so harshly now because we just understand it from a very different modern perspective. And our attitudes toward other people are very different. And so you have to strike that balance between what's going to be palatable to your reader and what is true and honest to the characters and would have had a very different perspective on the time that they were living in. And add to that I had characters who were fighting over whether or not colonization in Liberia of former American slaves was a good thing for the abolition movement or whether it wasn't. So it was a contested, heated argument at the time, and made by a lot of different people for a lot of different reasons. And I knew where my family members came down on it, and I wanted to be very faithful to that, but at the same time I wanted to honor my own family legacy, which there were attitudes that my ancestors 5 generations ago would have had with good intentions that are pretty abhorrent to us now. And it was hard to distance myself from that and to be able to be honest about that and to walk that line. At one point in that book, I actually did change the names of all of the characters away from the historical. I just renamed them completely and wrote the rest of the book. And then I changed it back. But I just had to have at least that layer of distance. Just, I don't know, for myself and my family. Fortunately, everybody was okay with it. It was fine. But
Yeah, that's tough. That makes sense, though. And good for you for deciding that you needed to do that in order to continue writing it, in the way that you wanted and the goals that you had to just put a little in boundaries and things like that.
yeah.
You've got a new novel coming out Thursday, April 18th. Can you give us a sneak peek into what it's about?
Yeah, this novel is called Paradise on the Pike, and it is a historical mystery that is set in the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, and I'm from the St. Louis area, so that made researching a lot easier. And it follows the story of Max, who is a German immigrant who receives an unexpected opportunity to move from his home in Stellingen, Germany, which is just north of Hamburg. Was just north of Hamburg. Now it's a neighborhood of Hamburg. But he has an abusive father, and he unexpectedly dies. He has the opportunity to come and live with family in St. Louis. And it's in 1903, and the city is just alive with the energy of anticipating this fair. And he gets a job on the Pike, which is the entertainment district of the fair. It's a mile-long street that has all of the fun stuff. And he ends up at Hagenbeck's Animal Paradise and Trained Animal Circus. And he is a zookeeper in this wonderful world of Hagenbeck's, who was a historical figure, and he is the man who's responsible for our modern zoo design and ushering in this idea that animals shouldn't be viewed in cages, but they should be viewed in open enclosures, and so that there's not much separation between the people observing them and the animals themselves, and they're in kind of natural environments and enjoying natural behaviors. And then Max falls in love, and there's a murder, and there's all kinds of sticky, interesting situation that sort of comes out of that.
Sounds fascinating.
Great.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love
Okay,
the 1904 World's Fair and a murder mystery, historical. I'm sold. I'm in. I can't wait.
Yeah, and
Oh.
the cover is by far my favorite of all of your novels. So definitely check that out. So, Sarah, where can we find you and your blog and your books?
Yeah, you can find me at sarah-angleton.com, where I blog still mostly weekly. You can find the book you can order it from any local bookstore. You can also order it from online retailers, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, those kinds of things. If you're local to St. Louis, you can find it at Main Street Books. I'm hoping very soon that you'll be able to find it at Sold on St. Louis at the grounds of the History Museum.
Oh, yay.
And yeah, that's...
Congratulations. That's
Yes.
very exciting.
Congrats.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us, Sarah, and sharing us your journey and about writing historical fiction.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a really fun conversation.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Wayward Writers.
Let's connect. Find us at waywardwriters.com, X, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook.
See you next time. Conquer your path.